Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today because we're jumping right into a profound spiritual journey into God's plan for the ultimate restoration of His creation. We're going to be looking at the breathtaking final chapters of the book of Ezekiel. Now, I want you to imagine being in exile, completely far from home, just surrounded by despair, because that's exactly where Ezekiel was, 25 years into captivity, 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem. But out of that total darkness, God unveils this meticulously detailed vision of a glorious restored sanctuary. So let's dive into this magnificent architectural blueprint of providence and see exactly what it reveals about the heart of God.
Here is our structured journey through the scriptures today. We're going to walk with Ezekiel from the outer gates in Ezekiel chapter 40 into the Holy of Holies in Ezekiel chapter 41. We'll witness the return of God's glory in Ezekiel chapter 43, the divine order in Ezekiel chapter 45, the river of life in Ezekiel chapter 47, and finally, the promised land restored in Ezekiel chapter 48.
Ezekiel chapter 40, the outer gates and holy order.
So, in Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 2 through 3, God takes Ezekiel in the Spirit to a very high mountain to witness this precise blueprint of providence. There, he meets a man who is literally shining like bronze, holding a measuring rod. Now, you might be wondering, why in the world did God show Ezekiel such a dizzying array of measurements and gates? Honestly, it can feel a little overwhelming when you're reading it. But the profound theological truth behind all those numbers is that God's plan for restoration isn't just haphazard or random. It is incredibly orderly, it's perfect, and it is deeply intentional. God is proving to us that the restoration of His people will be carried out flawlessly, exactly according to His divine design.
And a huge part of that exactness is about establishing boundaries. If we flip to Ezekiel chapter 42, verse 20, we see that the outer walls of the temple area measure a massive 500 cubits on every single side. Why so huge? Well, this massive wall serves one vital purpose, permanently separating the holy from the profane. It's there to protect the sanctity of God's dwelling place. It visually demonstrates to us that stepping into God's presence requires true reverence and a clear, definitive separation from the sins of the outside world.
Moving right along to Ezekiel chapter 41, into the Holy of Holies.
We are now being guided even deeper into the temple, moving from those outer courtyards into the very heart of holiness. And I want you to look closely at this number, 20. In Ezekiel chapter 41, verse 4, when the bronze figure measures the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, the length is 20 cubits and the width is 20 cubits. It is a perfect square. In biblical architecture, this perfectly symmetrical cube visually represents God's flawless, uncompromising justice and absolute perfection. It's a physical, spatial representation of His holy character.
And the interior details are absolutely marvel-inducing. The walls are covered in this beautiful wooden paneling, intricately carved with cherubim and flourishing palm trees, just as it's described in Ezekiel chapter 41, verses 18 and 19. And get this, each cherub has two faces, a human face and a lion's face. That symbolizes wisdom and majestic power. This brilliantly illustrates the glorious restoration of God's original creation. It intentionally echoes the Garden of Eden. And right in front of the Holy of Holies stands a wooden altar, which Ezekiel chapter 41 verse 22 calls the table that is before the Lord. That's a beautiful symbol of restored fellowship and communion between God and His people.
Next up, Ezekiel chapter 43, the return of God's glory.
You guys, this is the spiritual climax of the entire vision. I mean, a perfect temple really means nothing if it's empty, right? Back in Ezekiel chapter 10, the glory of the Lord had tragically departed from the previous temple because of the people's intense sin. But now, the Creator's glory comes rushing back from the east with a sound like roaring waters. Just take a second to absorb this breathtaking declaration from God found in Ezekiel chapter 43, verse 7. He tells Ezekiel, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever." What a beautiful promise of grace. His glory returning signifies complete reconciliation and providence over His people. God is essentially saying, I am back, and this time I am staying for good.
That brings us to Ezekiel chapter 45, divine justice and order.
Now, as the vision moves out into the surrounding lands, we get to see how God's holy presence within the temple must impact everyday life outside of it. Because God is perfectly just, His holy presence absolutely demands righteous leadership and equitable order.
Look at the duties of the princes in Ezekiel chapter 45, verses 9 through 12. God strictly commands the rulers to put away violence and oppression and to use honest scales and standard measurements. The leaders are even given their own specific land so they will never again steal the inheritance of the everyday people. It's God preventing the powerful from oppressing the weak. Then, look at the worshippers' rules in Ezekiel chapter 46, verse 9. During the appointed feasts, traffic in the temple is strictly one way. If you enter through the north gate, you have to exit through the south. You never turn around. This establishes a reverent, forward-moving order for all who enter His presence. Spiritually speaking, we must always move forward with God, never turning back to our old ways.
Now for Ezekiel chapter 47, the river of life.
Let's shift our focus to this astonishing, life-giving miracle. Ezekiel is brought back to the entrance of the temple, and he sees water just flowing out from right under the threshold heading east. In Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 3 through 5, the guide actually measures the flow of this water in stages of 1,000 cubits. And it's an awe-inspiring progression. First, the water's just ankle deep. Another 1,000 cubits, it's knee deep. Then it's waist deep. And finally, it becomes this uncrossable river, deep enough to swim in. This visually demonstrates the unstoppable, expanding, and ever-deepening grace of God's providence moving out from His throne and pouring into the whole world.
And where exactly does this miraculous river go? Well, according to Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 8 through 12, it flows right down into the Arabah and enters the Dead Sea, a place that is completely devoid of life. But when this holy water hits the Dead Sea, the salty waters actually become fresh. Swarms of living creatures begin to flourish, and fishermen stand along the shores. Along the banks grow these unfading fruit trees that yield fresh fruit every single month, and their leaves provide healing. It is absolute proof that no place, no matter how dead or desolate, is ever beyond the reach of God's restorative power.
Finally, we arrive at Ezekiel chapter 48, the promised land restored.
We now arrive at the final panoramic view of the vision, where the promised land is beautifully and meticulously restored, and the land is distributed among the 12 tribes of Israel. God's perfectly ordered map is just incredible to see. The land is divided into fair, parallel strips from north to south for all 12 tribes. Right in the middle is the central holy district, which is dedicated entirely to God, containing the sanctuary, the priests, and the prince. But honestly, perhaps the most shocking and beautiful grace of all is found just prior to this, in Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 22. God explicitly commands that foreign residents, strangers living among the Israelites, are to receive an equal inheritance of land right alongside the native-born Israelites. It is a stunning preview of the gospel, showing us that God's divine plan includes all nations in His kingdom.
As we reach the very end of the book, the city itself receives a brand new identity. The name of the city is declared to be Jehovah Shammah. This is a profound Hebrew phrase which translates simply but so powerfully to "the Lord is there."
Ezekiel chapter 48, verse 35, the very final verse of this incredible book, rings out in total triumph. And the name of the city from that time on will be "The Lord is there." This solidifies the believer's ultimate hope. It means that God has permanently returned. The exile is over, sin is dealt with, and the Creator dwells in unbroken, eternal fellowship with His people.
So as we wrap up this explainer today, I really want to leave you with a deeply personal question. Is the temple of your heart prepared for the glory of Jehovah Shammah? Just as God established clear boundaries, demanded justice, and required a separation of the holy from the profane in this visionary temple, we too have to examine our own spiritual boundaries. Are you making room for His presence to dwell within you, and are you letting His river of life flow outward into a broken world? I encourage you to really ponder that this week. Thank you so much for joining me to explore God's breathtaking plan for creation, and I will see you next time.